Thank you, and thanks for being there. As Robin mentioned, I am the journalist in residence documentary option for at least the next couple of years, and so I'm here to, yes, make documentary exciting, but also I'm here for you.
So I'm just checking to see what's going on with Francine. I don't know if her internet has cut out, unfortunately.
Yeah, because everybody else seems to be fine.
Yeah, everyone. Okay, let me just,
Looks like she signed off and will probably try to log back in.
yeah. So just sorry about that. Just be patient. I'm just checking to see with her on email.
Am I back?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I see you. Okay, good.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. The gods. Anyways, I was just about to say how thrilled I am to introduce my ex-colleague and a dear friend of mine, Julian Sher. Julian is, a very well-known investigative journalist in Canada. He is probably one of the foremost investigative journalists. He's done more big stories than I could possibly count. He's probably best known for his long tenure at the Fifth Estate. He was a producer and then the senior producer, uncovered many stories there, some of which you will hear about today. He's also the author of many books. He's written about the Ku Klux Klan, about biker gangs, about child predators, and the infamous Stephen Truscott affair that you will hear about today. He's also the creator and webmaster of journalism.net, which is a resource center site for journalists. And he's done extensive training all over the world. So you couldn't be in better hands, believe me. So without further ado, Julian, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. Bonjour, tout le monde. Thanks. I know most of you are probably zoomed out. So I've done a lot of training recently through Zoom, and I don't think there's anything more boring than listening to somebody in a lecture hall, much less on Zoom. So to try to make this interesting, obviously I'm going to play a lot of videos, but please interrupt all the time. While the videos are going, you could send me questions or send comments in the chat room, and I'll try to answer them as your chats come up. So don't be shy, interrupt. But certainly at the end, I'll try to play about 5 or 10 minute excerpts, and then we'll stop for questions. So there is no question period at the end of this class. It's 2 hours of questions. All right. You're all interested in documentary filmmaking. Francine and I can exchange some war stories because we work together on many documentaries. So please, that's the most important thing, is please interrupt all the time. It's not an interruption. It's part of the class. I also sent you my Twitter. You can tweet live as well and share some of your thoughts or screen grabs with people, because it's always good to encourage people and spread the word about what Concordia is doing. Okay, so let's hope there aren't too many technical glitches. I'm going to share my screen just so I could give you a couple of brief introductions. I hope this works. Here we go. And now I'm going to start the slideshow. Play from start. Okay, so we're going to look at the camera as storyteller. As you can see from these pictures, I've been around the world. I've been filming stories for television for the last 30 years, 35 years at least. as I was telling Francine, I'm in the midst of doing 2 documentaries right now, one on Afghanistan and one on organized crime in Montreal, and it's still a nightmare. It's still, it's like, it's not like riding a bicycle. I mean, in the sense that, every time you do a documentary, you get into this hellish situation in the edit room where you're going, this is crazy. It's not working. This is the worst piece of crap I have ever made. And then somehow, miraculously, it turns out usually quite well. So, just expect that, making television is a nightmare. There's a great joke I always tell people is the 2 things you never want to see being made are sausages and television. And that's very, very accurate. We are going, we are going to look, I'm going to cover, I hope to cover in the next 2 hours, 5 kind of themes of various documentaries. One about making history, one of the most famous documentaries I did about a wrongful conviction case. Then we'll look at taking your characters on a journey. And then we'll look at capturing moments in time with an execution story I did. And then we'll look at covering war, because I've covered some wars, and I've just come back from Afghanistan. Well, I was back a year ago, but we're finishing up a documentary. And then I want to end on truth and consequences and the responsibilities and the questions you have to ask yourself when you turn the camera on. I've already shared this information in the chat group, but tweet as we go along, or you could try to reach me at WhatsApp if the chat isn't working. Okay, so let me stop sharing just for a bit so I can come back. So let's start with making history. None of you were born, I have to assume, in 1959. But I was born in the 50s. And when you were a teenager in the early 60s, everybody remembered the story of Stephen Truscott, because Stephen Truscott was about my age. He was a teenager living in Southern Ontario. And there was this famous picture in one of the weekly magazines that everybody got in their newspaper of a young boy on his bicycle. And he was in prison, and he was sentenced to hang for murdering a 14-year-old classmate. And it just touched all of us that this boy would kill this girl and he'd be sentenced to hang. Canada had the death penalty back then. He lands up going to prison. The death sentence is commuted. He always maintains his innocence. And the controversy was so great in Canada, it's one of the things that leads to us abolishing the death penalty. Flash forward 30 years later, I'm now an adult. So is Stephen Truscott. He's actually a grandfather. He goes hidden for 30 years. Nobody hears from him. And we get contacted at the Fifth Estate. Stephen Truscott wants to tell his story. He wants to come public for the first time, and he wants to prove his innocence. So I'm going to play you an excerpt. Now, you have to understand that this would be like OJ disappearing for 30 years and then coming forward, right? This would be like Osama bin Laden disappearing for 30 years and then coming forward. I don't mean to compare him to either of those, but the point is, this was a famous person that nobody had seen for 30 years until we broadcast this story. So I'm going to play you the opening as it appeared on the show that Francine and I worked on, The Fifth Estate, in the year 2000. It's quite dated in terms of how TV worked back then. But I want you to look at the opening and take a look at how we started as a movie. We don't start it as new. We had shocking revelations. Nobody had seen this guy. We were going to prove pretty powerfully that there had been a miscarriage of justice. We had evidence of witnesses who had been hidden, bad science. But this is movie making, not newspaper writing. We didn't have a lead that would have put all that in the lead because we wanted to tell the story. So take a look, and I'm going to end it at a scene where we decided when we were going to show Stephen Truscott's face. And it was a shot that I designed and I knew about the minute I had the assignment. I said, this is how we're going to introduce Stephen. So you'll see how that shot ends. Let's hope the video works. Here goes. I will share the screen again. Okay. Now just give me a moment because it'll take a moment for me to pull up the proper, my docs, my training. Here we go. My docs. Books. Stephen Truscott. Okay, here is the opening. Should be full screen. All right, and here we go.
Welcome to the Fifth Estate. Marshal, Milgard, Moran, these names now represent painful reminders of the fallibility of the police and lawyers, judges, and juries. But before them all, there was Stephen Truscott. In 1959, when a 12-year-old girl disappeared on a hot June evening, an investigation lasting less than 2 days and a trial of less than 2 weeks sent a 14-year-old schoolboy on his way to the gallows. Stephen Truscott's murder trial was the most famous and infamous child criminal case in Canadian history. His death sentence was commuted, but he spent 10 years in prison. Since his release, Truscott has lived a secret life under an assumed name, shunning all publicity until now. Tonight, he breaks that 40-year silence. The Fifth Estate has reviewed the documentation in this case, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and followed leads ignored by the police at the time. And we've uncovered some astonishing new evidence, a long-hidden file whose contents raise disturbing questions about the integrity of the murder investigation and the fairness of his trial. Stephen Truscott's guilt is a historical fact, but is it true? Was the verdict just? He still maintains his innocence, but after 4 decades, it is now his word against history, and now posterity must judge. In tonight's program, key scenes are recreated based on verbatim accounts of witnesses and from military, police, and archival documents. In a Goderich, Ontario jail cell, he awaited the hangman. He was 14.
I woke up one day and somebody was building something outside the wall. You could hear the hammering, and I thought they were building the scaffold. And it's just kind of living in terror. And every day you expected it to be your last.
It was 1959, and his name was Stephen Truscott. Once his jailers saw his brother climbing a tree to catch a glimpse of him. So they moved the prisoner to a cell without a window.
The cell is lonely, the cell is cold. October is young, but the boy is old. Too old to cringe and too old to cry, though young, but never too young to die. At last we have something to boast about. We've a national law in the name of the Queen to hang a child who is just 14.
Columnist Pierre Burton broke journalistic conventions and wrote a bitter poem about the death sentence. A rare display of outrage amid all the sensational news stories. But it was 1959 when Canada still had mainly rural and small-town roots. A time of prosperity and order. People still presumed the infallibility of institutions like the justice system. In the summer of that year, just outside the Air Force Base at Clinton, Ontario, a single tragic incident would shatter many assumptions about the innocence of youth and about the safety of children. For days, there had been a heat wave. It was near the end of the school year. The children were restless. 2 of them set out on a bike ride that would carry them into Canadian legal history. The girl was Lynn Harper, aged 12. The boy was one of her classmates, Stephen Truscott, aged 14. 2 days later, searchers found her body in a wooded grove. In the more than 40 years since, there has been much controversy about what really happened on that evening. Partly because of it, Canadians abolished the death penalty. In that time, one voice has been absent from the debate, that of Stephen Truscott. He has chosen to live in a closed privacy until now.
It's important to me. I know that they got the wrong person. My kids are all growing up. We've discussed it as a family, and we figured it was time to come out.
Okay, so that's how that show started. I think we had 1.5 million people who watched it. Back then in a country of about 30 million. And then if you get rid of French Quebec, it was like 1 out of 20 people in Canada watched that show. We'll play other excerpts. It would eventually, Stephen and I had no idea it would take 10 years, but after that, I wrote a book on the case. And eventually in 10 years after we first met, he would be exonerated by the courts and get a $6 million settlement. So I wanted to get some comments from you right away, but what you noticed is we decided early on that we were not going to introduce him right off the top. We were going to build the tension. And I knew I had the idea of introducing him through the bike ride and going from black and white to color. And so even though it was the most famous reveal in television, seeing this man's face that hadn't been seen, we planned it that way quite artistically. Stephen still jokes that it took 4 hours to film that bicycle scene to get it right. The other interesting thing to consider is we did all the recreations with a film camera. We went and found an old film camera and got old film material. Right, because we were shooting in video by then. And we even scratched the video. And that black and white footage you see at the beginning, half of it is real footage from the time, and half of it is our footage. We did a good enough job that we were able to mix them. And the other final thing I wanted to say is we were lucky because when we went to film at the scene of the crime, that shot you see, that crane shot and that highway, hadn't changed since 1959, right? There were no new buildings. There was just a power line. All we had to do was stop traffic so a modern car wouldn't go by. And we were able to recreate the 50s. We hired all these high school kids, and you'll see later dressed up in 1950s. So that's how we decided, because we decided we had to take people back to a different country and a different time. And that's how we opened our movie. So let me see right away if there's any questions, any disputes, any criticisms of how we started that documentary. Any comments? Unmute and ask away.
I'm going to jump in because while people are gathering their thoughts, it always takes a bit. So you mentioned in your introduction how, you were doing TV, you weren't writing for a newspaper. And that affected your opening. I know one of the arresting things about the opening is you concentrated on the prison. Why did you concentrate on the prison?
We played around with the opening. We knew we were going to use his voice because you wanted to hear him. I think it was a combination of visual and emotional power. It was one of the most, to use no pun intended, it was one of the most arresting scenes, right? Because we could have shown, usually when I do crime docs, you start with the body. You always start with the body. So we could have started with the girl and you'd see her body. But we didn't have Lynn, obviously she was dead. We didn't have her family. And Stephen was our main character. And so the visuals of the prison are stunning, right?
This is the actual prison where he was?
Yeah, it's the actual prison. We went back, they let us film. It's the actual jail. It may not have been the jail cell he was in, but that, it hadn't changed. So, it was a golden opportunity to be able to use those visuals. But also what you have to think about is, it's a bit like, like I used to call it the Captain Kirk on the bridge scene, right? If those of you who are Star Trek fans, like TV works you try to grab people in the open 60 seconds before you go to commercial, right? Where you have the tease and go, oh my God, the planet's going to explode, and then bring in the high music and you cut the commercial. So people have to say, I want to stick around. So we had to grab people from the beginning. And by showing a prison, it's the whole theme, right? What's the most amazing? This country was going to execute a 14-year-old. And then Pierre Burton, who was famous back then, right? He was one of the most famous journalists. We found him. He was still writing on typewriters. And so we decided to use that to go with the emotion. So, I think visually and emotionally, and also our theme. What was our theme? Our theme was wrongful convictions, rush to judgment. Any questions from some of the students about why we did certain things? Any comments? I'm just trying to see if there's anything.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The music, the way that, because we don't, as viewers, we don't know yet, that there's all this strong evidence that says he's innocent. The music to me made me feel like, oh, did he do it? Are we looking at this evil killer right now when we see him? And it's because it's still was that on purpose to make, or?
Good question. Yeah. There's big controversy, especially at the time in the 90s at CBC. If you watched news at the time, and even to some degree today, but less so today, there was never any music in news because music is seen as emotional and also biased, right? Like somebody walking through the forest, if it's just melodic, it looks beautiful, but if it's dum, 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 the guy's the killer, right? So, so music completely changes it, right? We've always well, not always, but around that time, we started using music, and I think it has to be used journalistically. I think sometimes it's badly done. I think here, we call it a tension track, right? It creates that kind of mood. Nowadays, like for my Afghanistan doc, you spend thousands of dollars finding the right musician to score, when you do a real documentary. Here, we're just taking music that, if you do documentaries, there's this free music or largely free music that you get and you place in. So, it can be criticized. I think the music here works kind of because I think it's tense but neutral, right? I don't think you're necessarily saying that he's bad, but you are saying there's something dangerous happening here. Yeah. Music can be really important if it's used well.
I just want to jump in as a teacher here. Music is one of the trickiest things in documentary, and one of the most frequent errors is overusing music and doing carrot, so it's dramatic. So you put even more dramatic music, or it's a really tricky thing to get right. Yeah. I think Julian is right. I think it was a very good question, by the way. The music does manipulate you and you can't overdo that. It's a very delicate balance.
Yeah. And in fact, what's really important is the music should never tell you what you're supposed to feel. The music should come in after you feel something and then reinforce how you feel. Very well. So that's really, really important, right?
It sounds like music is kind of like adverbs.
Yes, it's good. Yeah, I mean, really, it's like music that, and in all television, when it comes to words, adverbs, and music, less is more, right?
Yes.
Always go for less. Always go for less. Okay. All right. I'm just going to fast forward. So I'm going to, whoa, it's already taking way much longer than I thought, but this is fun, I guess. I'm going to show you a couple of scenes now where we use some recreations to create the 1950s. And then I'm going to show you briefly some of the actual journalism, right? The actual facts. And then we'll go to the closing scene. So let me share the screen again, and it'll just take me a while to fast forward. Okay, so let's see, it should be at around 5:55. Okay. So here's some examples of where we do some recreations. It's funny because the murder takes place in June. We're filming in October. It is freezing. And we have these blankets to throw on the kids in between our filming. Here you go.
Where his life changed so dramatically when he was 14. June 9th, 1959. A small bridge over a slow river. It was all you needed when you were 14 and life was coming into focus. Stephen was popular and athletic, usually at the river with the other boys or on the playing fields at the school. That's where he was, on his bike, at 7 in the evening, June 9th. Lynn Harper was also there.
Sorry.
She was the daughter of an officer on the Clinton base.
Lynn Harper came over to the bike and more or less asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm
Hold on,
going
I was
down
trying
the
to
river
make it
see
full
if any
screen
of the
and I
kids are
lost
down
it.
there.
So give me a moment.
And she asked me if she could have a ride down to the highway. I thought, well, I'm going down that
Give
way
me a
anyhow.
moment. Ah, here it is.
Tiny
Okay.
little moment. Yeah, a tiny little moment
There we
that
go.
kind of changed everybody's life.
Okay, I'm gonna go back. Here we go. And I will share screen again.
Usually at the river with the other boys or on the playing fields at the school. That's where he was, on his bike, at 7 in the evening, June
Give me a
9th.
moment, guys. Sorry.
Lynn Harper was also there. She was the daughter of an officer on the Clinton base.
Lynn
There we
Harper
go.
came over to the bike and more or less asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm going down to the river to see if any of the kids are down there. And she asked me if she could have a ride down to the highway. I thought, well, I'm going down that way anyhow. A tiny little moment. Yeah, a tiny little moment that kind of changed everybody's life.
He says that Lynn told him that she'd squabbled with her parents at supper time. She wanted to go to the main highway, and from there she was going to a place where there were ponies. Along the way, they passed a wheat field and a grove of trees known as Farmer Lawson's Bush.
Okay, I'm now going to fast forward to where we reveal some of the problems with the testimony. Okay, here we go.
It was no longer a joke.
But two other witnesses would strike a serious blow at the prosecution theory. Remember the geography. If Stephen and Lynn crossed the bridge, he could not have killed her in the bush. And two witnesses insisted they saw them cross the bridge, riding double on his bike. One of them was an 11-year-old who was at the river catching turtles. As he climbed the embankment to the bridge to go home, he said that Stephen and Lynn rode by. His name was Dougie Oates, and more than 40 years later, he's still positive that he saw them.
I recall saying hi and waving at them, and Lynn smiling back. I don't recall any real reaction from Stephen as he was pedaling down the road, heading towards highway number 8.
No doubt in your mind about it.
There is absolutely no doubt in my mind. I saw both of them. Well, I couldn't see one of them without the other, but they were both, they were riding double on Steve's bike across the river.
You see, if your memory is sharp, then Stephen Truscott is innocent.
I don't know how anybody could have come to any other conclusion. I could see that maybe being dismissed if I was the only one that had seen them cross the bridge, but in fact, I know I'm not the only one that saw them cross the bridge.
So that was a really important reveal, because finding witnesses that could show that Stephen had crossed the bridge and could not have killed Lynn. And finally, I want to show you the big reveal we did about the bad forensic evidence. Comes up right here.
Would have to prove she died between 7:15 and 7:45. The local coroner was Dr. John Peniston. Relying mainly on the analysis of Lynn's stomach contents, he placed the time of death precisely in that half-hour window, an astonishing precision even with the forensic tools available today. It was such a crucial piece of evidence that we asked for some expert opinions on the validity of Dr. Peniston's conclusions. Dr. John Butt is former chief medical examiner for Nova Scotia. Years working mostly as a prosecution expert have taught him to be very careful drawing conclusions from stomach contents.
I mean, I think the one thing that you can learn is perhaps what the person ate at the last meal. I don't think it tells you anything precise about the time of death.
Well, it sure told the police and the pathologists of the time a lot. It told them that she died sometime between 7:15 and 7:30 on the night of June the 9th.
Well, the big question here is whether or not that information that was said to have been developed from the stomach contents, quote unquote, scientifically, was meeting some predetermined parameter.
Way of saying that Dr. Peniston might have been tailoring his conclusions to substantiate the suspicions of policemen. It was difficult to challenge Dr. Peniston's conclusions since the prosecution never entered his official autopsy report into evidence.
I don't think there is any medical or forensic evidence which clearly links Stephen Truscott with Lynn Harper's death.
And finally, I want to show you how as we presented all the evidence, and then we come back, of course, to our main character, and just take a look at the almost closing scenes.
Stephen Truscott decided early on only to tell his children who he really was when they became teenagers. Leslie and her brother Ryan say the truth only deepened their admiration for their father. Did you ever have any doubt that, my gosh, there's a dark side to my father that I didn't know about?
No.
Never crossed your mind?
Never. My dad is the most laid back, relaxed person I've ever met in my life. It's just, I'm sure everything that he went through with all the time in jail and that has really molded the wonderful person that he's become. And
I guess I just couldn't imagine going through having all of my rights taken away from me, having my family taken away, everything taken away from me, and to be able to live through to tell about it. People talk about heroes all the time. And who do you admire and who's your hero in your life? And we don't even have to go anywhere but our house.
I've got the other box that came in.
The murder of Lynn Harper and his conviction have become, not surprisingly, an obsession for Stephen Truscott and his wife Marlene, who has absorbed an encyclopedic knowledge of his case.
Same time.
And
But Philip Burns was supposed to have left the bridge and walked home. And according to the police files, it took him 30 minutes right from there. I've taken things day by day. I've taken them witness by witness. I've gone over it and over and over it. And it all amounts to one thing. They were on a quest. It's him they have in mind. So while they're getting all this information to have him convicted, the murderer runs free.
In 1997, Truscott was briefly hopeful that breakthroughs in DNA testing would finally vindicate him. But after months of searching, authorities could only turn up this list showing that most of the key evidence where the killer's genetic material might be found had been destroyed. Genetic testing might have solved the mystery once and for all, but no one will ever know beyond a reasonable doubt who killed Lynn Harper. Sergeant Alexander Kalachuk lies in a grave in Seaforth, at rest after a tortured life. He spent his final years in and out of psychiatric institutions, and when he was out, was usually lost in a haze of alcoholism, which eventually killed him in 1975. The man who, in the eyes of the law, is the murderer is now enjoying a serene middle age, at peace with himself and his family, and after 30 years, preparing to resume his real identity and his name, Stephen Truscott. determined to continue the effort to prove his innocence, even though he knows it's now his word against history. Why it's so important for you guys as a couple, as a family, to keep pursuing this. Whether he did it or not, he's scot-free. He did his time. He owes nothing to society.
He is not scot-free. He goes to bed every night as a convicted murderer, and he wakes up every morning as a convicted murderer. And why should he be?
I want to see justice done. Justice hasn't been done. Not to the Harper family and not to my family. So I mean, for both families. It's all after 40 years, I don't think that's too much to ask.
Sorry for the glitches in some of that playback. I should mention that that reference to Kalachuk and that graveyard, we point to another more likely suspect in the documentary. So what I just wanted to say about that is, as you see, we did a lot of investigation, and in 42 minutes of the documentary, we reveal a lot of the problems with the case. But in the end, it still has to be an emotional journey. And we fought long and hard, and we didn't get the kids on camera until about a week before we went on air. And we knew we were going to end with Leslie and Ryan. When we knew we had the grandparent scene, we were going to save that to the end, and those closing clips from the two of them, from Marlene and Stephen. By the way, I'm writing an article right now for the Toronto Star. It should be out, I hope, in 3 weeks, because there's a movie that's been made, like a fiction movie that's been made on the Stephen Truscott case. It's based around his wife. It's called Marlene. So it's fun because there's an actor who plays me, and some of the scenes you're seeing there, you'll see in the movie recreated by actors. So I'm writing an article about what it's like to see real journalism turned into fiction. But it does capture the emotion of TV storytelling. So any questions? It's a little hard to get a sense of how the whole documentary worked because I just showed you some excerpts. But any questions about how we did it and how we constructed it?
Yes, I have a question. Why did you decide to integrate, to put the reporter, the journalist in the documentary?
Oh, that's an excellent question. There are different styles of documentary making. The CBC, and particularly the Fifth Estate, is strongly host-driven. So when I worked with Francine, with Lyndon, it's the detectives, right? Like 60 Minutes, right? You see the journalist all the time. They ask the questions, and that can be a very effective if you have somebody as talented as Francine or Lyndon. Lyndon's questions are excellent. So it's a very particular form, which is hardly used today in most documentaries you watch on Netflix or in the theaters. If you look at any of my recent documentaries that I'm going to show you, there is no journalist, right? They're you know, so, but it's a very particular form of TV news making, right? You would never do it in a feature documentary, unless, and I'm going to show you one example, the latest documentary I'm doing, where it is all about the journalist going back to uncover truth, right? So he becomes a character. Normally, I would not do that, right? It has strengths and weaknesses. I like it because you get the, you know, it's kind of, you know, the detective on the search for truth. But it's a very dated form of documentary making.
It's very much a TV convention where the idea is your reporter is the representative of the public. He is asking the questions for you. And therefore you have to like this guy, you have to trust him. But it's that kind of, it's a TV convention. And a lot of purists in the documentary field would say, you would never do that. Like, well, as Julian just said that.
Yeah.
Or you wouldn't even have, for some purists, you wouldn't even have a narration, let alone a face. But
Yeah.
it was very much, I mean, if anyone did it well, it was the Fifth Estate. In fact, I have going to ask a question. One thing you do really well, and this is really hard as well, is recreation.
Yeah.
Most recreation looks fake. Yours looks absolutely real. How did you, what is the secret to making it look as real as you did?
Well, I think the first point is to avoid it at all costs. Do not do recreations unless you have a multi-million-dollar budget. So on the current doc I'm working on, which is which is about the cocaine trade in Montreal and the West End gang, which is the Irish mafia that ran the West End of Montreal. We have decided to do no recreations. Because especially if you're doing modern day ones, it's just so, right, you'd have to get the right cars and the right guns, and it just looks so bad, right? So generally I would avoid recreations like the plague. You could do evocative, so that's sometimes you just have, you know, branches and trees and dust. You could do a bit of that. In this case, we felt it was impossible not to do recreations because we had to, you know, so we storyboarded, we mapped it out. We relied, as we said at the beginning, on court testimony. So we weren't going to fake anything. We were relying on what the court said happened and how it happened. And we filmed for days and days and days to get a handful of minutes to capture the look. And again, we were very minimalist, right? So you just see feet and handlebars and people, kids fishing in the water. But generally, really avoid recreations at all costs. And if you have to do it, then plan it really, really well and do it in a minimalist way. Any other questions? Somebody asked, yeah, when you contacted you, how did you verify he was who he says he was? Well, no, that was easy in the sense, I mean, but when we got the contact, we went to visit him. We could see the pictures. It was clear it was him. He had, personal information. So it was absolutely clear. And also nobody would want to impersonate him. This guy was a convicted murderer, right? So it's not like he was planning, he was not planning to be the son of the czar or something like that. Okay. So let's move on to, if there's no other questions about that, let me move on to a second example, also crime documentary. In this case, though, I want to make a point. Let me share my slideshow. Share screen. Here we go. And then I'm gonna slideshow, and we'll pick it up from here. Slideshow from play from current slide. This is part of a wider slideshow I do when I'm training. What's really key in any documentary is that your characters have to go on a journey. They have to struggle, they have to win, they have to lose, they have to discover. In other words, they have to grow and change. And the problem is, most of the time when you've come to film somebody, they're already finished their journey. So they're often dead and you have to bring them back alive, or they're angry and you have to go back to when they were happy, or they're beaten and you have to go back to when they had hope, or they did something bad, you have to go back to when they were good. So what I always try to do is map out the four, I call it the 4 C's. You need to establish who the character is. You need to create the context. Then you have to build the conflict, and finally the conclusion. So I want to show you how we did that with this story of a mother who was wrongly accused of killing her baby. And you'll see how we carry through that arc. So I can't stress this enough. Like Stephen Truscott, when I meet him, The good news is he's halfway through his journey, right? He's no longer a boy. He's been in prison for 10 years, secret life for 30 years, and now he's going to fight for justice. So we had to recreate him as a young boy, literally with pictures. And he had to tell us a story of what it was like being a young boy. And we talked to friends about what he was like. And we tell his whole story about hiding as a grandfather. And then we come about 3/4 of the way. And now, 10 years later, his journey is finished and he's acquitted. And there's been documentaries made since. In many cases, the story I'm doing right now about the West End gang, 3 of the main characters are dead. So I have to figure out ways of bringing them back to life and finding their family and friends. So before they become world-class drug lords and killers, they have to be little boys growing up in Point St. Charles and having dreams and whatnot. So this is key in documentary filmmaking. Your character must go on a journey from beginning, middle, and end. And your challenge is you've almost always arrived at the end. Some documentaries spend 7 years filming somebody and they're actually live. That's great, but you're not going to have that luxury most of the time. So your first challenge when you sit down with somebody and they agree to be filmed for you is you have to figure out, how do I tell their story from the beginning, from the time they were a kid, or the time they, even if you're doing a short documentary on, I don't know, a student at Concordia who's kicked out for making racist remarks, say, well, you have to go back to when that student first signed up in school, when they were respected, when they were liked, then they make a mistake, whatever. You've got to go back and make a journey. It is extremely hard, but it's vital. It's absolutely vital. So watch the opening scene. This is a mother named Brenda Wadby. It was a series I did for Global about 10 years after I did the Stephen Truscott documentary. No journalist, but there is a narrator. You'll see the tease opening, and you'll see the opening scenes we built with Brenda Wadby. Again, recreations done in a modern setting, but you'll see how the mood is quite different from the mood we do in the Stephen Truscott story. So I'm going to share the screen, and you'll watch the beginning of the Brenda Wadby story. Okay, here we go. Let me lose this. Let me drop this. Just let me find. Here we go. Crime, a mother's ordeal. All right.
It is every mother's nightmare. Her baby daughter is found dead, but her anguish is just beginning. She is accused of the crime. The whole town turns against her.
She was an outcast. The community was appalled.
But she insists she's innocent.
I wanted them to catch the killer, but they thought the killer was me.
This is the heartbreaking ordeal one mother endured to clear her name. Small cities that offer peace and quiet, like Peterborough, Ontario, pride themselves on being safe places to raise children. Which is why what happened here to a baby girl in January of 1997 was so disturbing. It was just past midnight. Brenda Wadby had been out for hours with a friend. She had left her 2 young daughters at home with a babysitter, a teenaged boy who lived upstairs with his mother.
I didn't feel the need to call home because these people had babysat for me before. I never ever thought that anything real terrible had gone wrong.
Wadby's oldest daughter, Justine, was 7 years old then.
It was like a bad nightmare I woke up to. And I started screaming, "Where the hell is my sister?" And nobody would tell me.
Her baby sister had been rushed to hospital. By the time their mother got there, Jenna was dead.
There she was. She was on a gurney. Her eyes were pointed in different directions. They were gray.
The autopsy of 21-month-old Jenna was grim. Multiple burns, rib fractures, head injury. The little girl had been brutally beaten to death. That night, and for weeks and months after, the police kept questioning Wadby. She failed the lie detector test, but at no time did she admit to beating her baby. The police also questioned the babysitter who was there, but their suspicion never wavered from Jenna's mother.
They would look at Brenda Wadby and say, hey, this is a single mother. She was supposed to go out for a short period of time, but she was out for hours. She left her 21-month-old baby with a 14-year-old boy. Mothers shouldn't do that. They saw somebody who could kill their own child.
Wadby was someone with a troubled past. It didn't take the police long to find out that until a few months before her baby's death, Wadby was a heavy drug user. She was struggling on welfare with 2 kids, not able to support them, sliding into cocaine abuse.
My house was in a state of a mess. I don't even know if there was food in the cupboards. I know I was bad, Mom. At that point in my life, I was really a horrible mother.
Now, when I started that documentary, we met with Brenda. It was obviously not as famous as Stephen Truscott, but there had been some news about it. And, you know, she had claimed that, you know, I was wrongly accused of killing my baby and I didn't do it. And we had same thing. We were in touch with her lawyer and we gathered a lot of evidence. In this case too, it came down to really bad science. The courts believed the pathologist, who has since become infamous. There were 19 families who were wrongly accused of killing their baby, when in most cases it was an accident. I wrote an article, you can Google it. I think it's called Trials and Error on Walrus, in Walrus magazine, about many of these cases. So Brenda was one of them. But the point I want to make is when we sat down, I'm going to tell you 2 stories. The first time I met Stephen Truscott, you know, we were quite excited because it was a famous case. But I remember, and it's actually a scene in the movie that you'll see when it comes out in the spring. I said, Stephen, I'm a journalist. I'm not here to prove you innocent. If you want to be proven innocent, go hire a lawyer. I'm here to dig for the truth. And he said, I have no trouble with that. I'm not afraid of what you'll find. Dig as much as you want. And that was important for me because I have spent many times, you know, in prison where people say, I'm innocent, you know, and it was important to see that Stephen was saying, that's fine. I have confidence. You go search and turn over all the rocks you want. When I met Brenda, I knew that she had been a cocaine addict. I knew that she'd been a horrible mother. I knew that she, the police were right to have put her near the top of the suspect list, right? And we were going to take her on a journey of this woman who was hated by everybody in town and kind of had a scarlet letter on her, and then would eventually become a heroine for proving herself innocent. But I needed that journey to take place. And I couldn't fight with her if she was going to say, no, I was wonderful. I was a great mom. So in the pre-interview, when she said, I was a bad mother, I said, we have a story because I have a journey. I have a journey of a mother who was a complete cocaine addict, who felt guilty about her daughter's death, and we could take her on the journey. Spoiler alert, the babysitter did it. the 14-year-old babysitter was a troubled kid, and he lands up, killing and we of course reveal that towards the end. So that's how we structured the opening 3-4 minutes, right? Where we needed to recreate the scene, recreate the horror. You had to think, who is this woman, right? Who would be such a horrible mom? So we had to take you on a journey too, where you thought she was guilty until the end of the movie. So any questions about that before I show you kind of the how we kind of ended?
Yeah, quick question about the music. Did you compose it this time, or was it the same on like open source?
Same thing, open source music. Almost all TV documentaries done for networks rarely compose their own music. It's way too expensive, right? So you just grab it off these CDs, right? I don't like this music so much, but it kind of worked. It's a little heavy for me, right? But it's global, so
you can tell. Yeah, you can tell.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little over the top. Yeah, there was a couple of other. Yeah, that's basically it. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with the details. We actually get hold of interrogation tapes. There's an amazing scene where you see her confessing after being badgered by the cops, and then we take that apart. But what I want to show you is the end. So 40 minutes later, after she's convicted, they take her other children away. She fights to prove her innocence, and then in the end, DNA and other, totally convict the babysitter, and she was innocent. We need to wrap. But unlike Truscott ended with him saying, I'm innocent, and I want the truth to come out, and it would take 7 years for the truth to come out. In her case, we have a victory, but I still needed her to reflect back on being a bad mother. And I knew I was going to ask her a question. Is there a difference between between abuse and neglect, right? That, you didn't kill your daughter, but maybe did you abuse her? And what's the guilt you feel? And Brenda's smart enough to give a really good answer. So watch how the movie ends. I'm going to share the screen again. Share. Okay, so here's the confession, by the way. You see the whole confession, and then she retracts the confession, and we have a lot of evidence. And then we end with this scene.
Some compensation from the Ontario government, along with the other victims of Dr. Charles Smith.
Okay, Justine, here's a bracelet for you from Big Sisters. One is for you, one is for me. I'll put yours on, you put mine on, and I will never be taking it off.
Wow. Justine graduated at the top of her class in high school and hopes to go to college to learn to work with children. Her mother, for her part, also has college on her mind, to become a paralegal.
Nice hit.
Wadby has regained full custody of both her children and is trying to rebuild a normal family life.
Your eye on the ball.
She's the first to admit she was negligent when she was on cocaine.
Good boy. All right.
To this day, she insists she never physically abused any of her children, but she still lives with deep regret.
I'm not sure what the borderline between neglect and abuse would be. I guess there is no borderline there. I guess neglect is abuse. But it's what you do to fix that. And I think over the last few years, I have worked really, really hard to become a better parent for my kids.
So that for me was really important. By the way, because there's no journalist, I'm the journalist, I'm asking the questions, and you're never going to hear my questions. So a technique you have to do is I have to ask the questions in a way that she'll repeat the answer. She'll repeat the question in the answer. So, I would say, I didn't want yes or no. So I would say, what's the difference in your mind between abuse and neglect? And then that's gonna be a trigger word, and she's gonna have to use those words, abuse and neglect, because you're not gonna hear my question. So that's important. We also took the decision, notice those interviews are filmed against black. We threw some color if you look at some of the other ones, right? So you have to decide what's the background gonna be. With Stephen, we wanted to recreate his house and get a sense of warmth, but here, everybody was filmed against a very neutral black background because we wanted that kind of starkness. Also, you have to storyboard. I knew when I started this, I had to show her as a cocaine addict. So you didn't see it there, but we had scenes of her walking and in dark alleys and in a really shabby home that was her home, to recreate what it was like when she was a cokehead. But I also knew I had to have that happy ending scene. Now, we couldn't show her younger boy because he was a minor, so it's carefully filmed. You think you see him, but actually you never do, right? The little tap on the head, the shadow shot of him playing ball. But I said, we need to figure out a way to film you with the kids. And when she said, well, I take my boy to a baseball game, we scrambled and we filmed it because I knew it was going to be a closing scene. So you have to storyboard. You have to say, I need these kinds of scenes, and then figure out how you're going to film them. So that's how we ended that doc. Same thing happened with her. She got compensation, and she's considered a heroine for clearing her name. Any questions before we move on to? Not sure what we'll do. Maybe we'll look at some war docs.
I have a question. So did she ever say what happened that she stopped using cocaine? Because that's kind of the tipping point in her life.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, in the journey, you soon after the baby dies, there's a great scene, and again, that's good. When I knew that happened, we had to recreate it. So she writes a diary, which we had. So we filmed her rewriting those exact words where she says, I have to go clean. I have to save my other children. You see the words, and then she tells us that story as well. Yeah, that's important because she has to make that turn, right? Otherwise, the movie doesn't work, right? If she's a cokehead, she can't just be then proven innocent by science. She has to have regret, and she has to change. Yeah, good point. And also that woman who comes in at the end, she loses Justine to a foster mom, and that foster mom lands up becoming quite close to Brenda. So she becomes a character, and Justine goes on her journey, right? And I draw maps, like when I'm doing my story, I've got maps of my characters, so I see how they're moving and how they intersect, right? And you plot out certain, turning points. Yeah. So a good example, I wonder if I could briefly find it. Let me just see. I'm just looking for something, and then if I find the shot, I will show it to you. Here it is, perfect. Oh, yes. Okay, I'm just gonna show you something because it really leads to what we were talking about. So you need journey, but then you have to figure out how you're gonna film it. So I knew Justine, you met her at the beginning, right? She's a 7-year-old. She's saying, what happened? How come my sister disappeared? And Justine at the beginning hates her mom for being a cokehead. I should have shown you that clip where she says there was no food in the fridge. All mom cared about was coke. And then we filmed Justine alone, sullen, leaning against the wall. But then we know Justine is gonna make a turn when she gets adopted by this, it's not adopted, but like kind of a big sister. How are we gonna film that? Back in the days, I still do it a bit, but I run a lot. So especially when I'm on shoot, I go running in a town to look at locations. And right near our hotel, I see this railway track and a bridge. And I know instantly I'm going to be able to use that because railway tracks and bridges and rivers suggest time. So to illustrate Justine's journey, look at the shot we used.
I lost my sister and I was gonna lose my mom.
Justine confided a lot in Lynn Sevink, who became a mentor for her as part of the Big Sister program.
I was scared, I was terrified, I was confused, I didn't know what was going on.
She was very torn because her loyalty was to her mom. But she did have doubts because the media and everybody was saying that her mom was guilty. She didn't want to think that her mom did it. But yet, when it went on for so long, it was pretty hard for her not to think that possibly might have been.
So,
but what Justine and almost.
So it's a bit hokey. It's a bit traditional. It's a bit traditional. The train track, the whole. But it worked. It was. And also back then, we have like a day of shooting, right, in Peterborough to get all these visuals done. So once I know I need her to go on a journey, the train tracks were a great way to illustrate it. Notice, by the way, especially when you don't have a journalist, you always try to have at least 2 cameras. So you notice that shot with Lynn, right? If you can get a second camera and especially make it a sharp profile, it gives you both a cutaway because you have to be able to avoid jump cuts, but also it gives you a more dramatic look at the person in profile. So sometimes you jump to the second camera even when you don't need the cutaway, because it just gives you that advantage. These days, when you film in HD, you could, with just one camera, you could punch in by 50%. And that'll give you your close-up. I hope I'm not being too technical, but the point about HD is that if you're filming me like this right now, and then the camera goes in like that, I could avoid a jump cut by just punching in. So that's good, but getting a profile shot or a different angle creates more tension. So that's what we do. Another small trick while we're at it, if you noticed in the Truscott movie, when we interview him and his wife, and when we interview the 2 kids, if you can interview 2 people together, it creates a natural cutaway because you can film the other person watching the other person. And you do it also not just to avoid jump cuts, but to increase the tension. So first of all, it's really important to put them not sitting side by side, because the eyes, if I had somebody right next to me, our human eyes think you're sitting quite close, but all the camera sees is this huge hole. So usually if you film 2 people, you put the person a bit behind. So you see there's no difference between that face and my face. That's how we filmed the 2 kids and Stephen. And after the interview, you keep going for a bit and you get the camera to film cutaways. So you notice when Leslie turns to her brother, you use those cutaways of the eyes. So it's a technique where you're not just trying to avoid jump cuts, you're actually increasing the tension by having somebody look at somebody else, that kind of thing. The other thing we did in our recent filming where we're doing is you usually have to take room tone when you're filming. All rooms are different. So when you film, you spend about 30 seconds of silence. What's great is the human body, and especially people who aren't used to television, can't stand silent and get really nervous. So we don't tell the person, but we're actually still filming. So when we say there's room tone, your guest inevitably kind of just starts looking down and thinking, and it's a great visual, right? Because the person isn't talking, is a bit nervous, or could be a bit relaxed. It's a beautiful way to get nice setup shots of your guest. That is quite natural. Okay, any other questions about that story and the journey? Okay. Oh yeah.
Just a quick question. When you're setting up that shot of them walking across the bridge and they you got that shot of them holding hands and talking about, how do you set that up for them? Are you like, okay, can you please walk across the bridge and talk about this? Or
question. That's a good question. Yeah, remember I said the two things you never want to watch being made is television and sausages. The other thing you should never believe from a producer is when a producer says, this will just take a few minutes, right? You know, we just need you to walk across the bridge, because of course they walked across that bridge, I think 4 to 5 times, right? So you tell them what the scene, you have to tell them, you know, you say, we're trying to illustrate Justine's journey and her nervousness about her mom's guilt. So you tell them what it's about, and we need you talking about that. But we're going to have to film it multiple times. So, you know, and notice she's mic'd, right? So I can't remember what order. I think usually we would do the close-up shot first. So we will film them walking and talking to make sure we have the sound and the clip. We can always put the sound over something else, but we need that clip. So we have to do that a couple of times because they either don't say it right or they mumble. Or once we get that, we know we have it, then we just need the covering shots. And then we ask them to walk 4 or 5 times, because as you notice, we have the long shot, then we have to do the rear shot, then we go on the side and we get that side shot. So they walked 4 or 5 times. Stephen on that bicycle was 4 hours. Right, to just get what we needed. Wasn't completely 4 hours of filming, but just to get that shot, to get the shadow shots. So yes, you have to block these things out for sure. Yeah. Okay, now we've only got 40 minutes. We've only done 2 of the 6 documentaries I wanted to show. So we're gonna have to make some hard choices here. I'm trying to think what I should show you. I was going to show you another crime doc, but I'm going to jump ahead instead and go into some war stories. One, because, you know, it's war and it's bang, bang, and it's always fun. But also, unlike Truscott, where we could spend a week recreating with cameras and stop the traffic and, you know, and do those beautiful recreations, or in Brenda's case where we're in Peterborough and, you know, we could film all we want and find and that's what we do. I looked for alleyways where, you know, I could get Justine leaning against a wall. And you saw that opening scene where Brenda is gazing at the water. You know, I look for those locations where I could do those sunset shots and those gazing shots. That's when you're in complete control in a documentary. Obviously, when you go to Afghanistan or Baghdad, you have very little control. You're running against the clock. You constantly have to worry about your own safety and the safety of the people you're filming. So it is it's a huge risk to yourself, and it's very hard to do the filming that you need to do. I'm just trying to think of which one. Well, we'll start with Afghanistan in case we don't have time to go to Baghdad. So I went to Afghanistan in 2007. It may have been 2009. I can't quite remember. It was at the height of the war when Canada was very heavily involved. Again, a lot of you may be too young to remember how important the Afghanistan war was for Canada. It was Canada's first big war since Korea. More Canadian soldiers died there than in any war since the Korean War. 150 dead. We spent millions of dollars. And Afghanistan was seen as the good war. Iraq was the bad war, right? Bush had lied or been misled about WMDs. Iraq was turning, and I was in Baghdad just before going to Afghanistan for the New York Times. It was obvious to everybody the Iraq war was a disaster. But Afghanistan, we were on the side of the good guys, right? We were there to help women, democracy. It was the good war. And it, of course, turned into, pardon the language, a complete shit show. You followed the news today, America is withdrawing. So I'm actually doing a new documentary, which will air on TVO in the spring, called Ghost of Afghanistan, where we look at that 20-year history, and it's about how the good war turned bad. I can't show you any excerpts because it hasn't been released yet, but I'll show you some teasers in a moment. But back in 2007, I get sent to Afghanistan because CBC is doing a big documentary called Afghanistan Between Hope and Fear. And it was it had 3 different directors, and a lot of it showed the hope, the midwives, the education. Of course, I get the fear part, right? I get the Taliban because I'm not interested in good news, and I want the bad stuff. So my job was to do the fear part of the story. So let me show you the initial opening, and it's how you set a scene. Just shows kind of the happiness, and then I'll show you 6 minutes of filming in Kandahar, and the filming in Kandahar is all done by me, because our cameraman, a great cameraman named Louis, is blonde, blue-eyed, hopeless for filming in Kandahar. I'm quite dark-skinned. I can grow a beard. I can pass as an Afghan. So I had to do my own. I had to learn how to film, which I've since done quite a lot now. And I did all my own filming for that sequence. So watch how we try to create mood from some shots. You'll see the opening minute 30, which is quite colorful and moody. And then I'll jump to the Kandahar scene. Okay, let's hope it works. Share screen. Okay, I have to find the cut down version, so give me a moment. Afghanistan, here we go. All right. Okay, you'll see the opening and then my Kandahar 6 minutes.
It is a dramatic and timeless landscape. Invaded and abandoned over the centuries, ravaged with brutal force. "31 million people, more than a dozen ethnicities. Young faces are everywhere. Nearly half the population under 15 years old. A new beginning is being written for the people of Afghanistan.
Okay, now you're going to see what I filmed in Kandahar. It's a brief chapter called City on Edge.
This is Kandahar. Afghanistan's second largest city is bustling and vibrant. People are enjoying their newfound freedom. This building used to house the much-feared Taliban Ministry of Vice. Now, it's a shopping mall. But this is where the Taliban first took power. They still hold sway in the surrounding countryside, and their influence is seeping back into the city. The South remains deeply conservative. No woman would dare step outside without wearing a burqa. But once safely inside the walls of a school, it's a different story. These young female students are only too happy to shed their burqas and the ideas of the past. This haven for 400 students is called the Afghan Canadian Community Center, funded mainly by private Canadian donors.
Yeah, that date. You have to put that date here.
For 18-year-old Sahala and her friends, it is a chance their mothers never had.
I would like to brighten my future. I mean, I have seen our father and mothers. My mother, like some of them are not educated, and they are like in such in dark place. They cannot judge what's good and what's bad.
Today, 35% of the students across the country are female. A remarkable achievement in a country where not a single girl was in school 6 years ago when the Taliban banned the education of women. But even out of power, the Taliban are trying to turn back the clock. They have burned down schools and attacked students. One day, on the way to school recently, Sahala came across the corpse of a woman.
Somebody had killed her, and then they had thrown her there, and then there was a letter written in that if any other girls go to school, we will do the same situation to her. I mean, it's really scary.
Can you tell me what was in the next paragraph?
School director Ihsan Ullah Ihsan marvels at the courage his students show every day just by coming to class. After the defeat of the Taliban, he returned to Afghanistan with big dreams.
I did come with hope. At least I thought I would be free to give education to my fellow Afghans in need. But that hope was fading away day by day.
A message posted on the school's website warned that he and his children would be killed. Death threats even come on his cell phone. So regularly, he saved the number so he knows when not to answer.
The increase of assassinations, kidnappings, robberies, briberies, and threats have added up to the fear of people.
Kandahar is a city on the edge. At checkpoints everywhere, police are always searching for potential suicide bombers. Knives at the ready, not as a weapon, but to scrape away anything that could hide a vehicle's deadly cargo. Scratch below the surface in Kandahar, and you can see the tension and fear that simmer underneath.
What I'm experiencing is a rising level of fear and paralysis on the part of the people that is just, it is palpable. She first came to Kandahar to cover the war, but American journalist Sarah Chase never left. She started a small cooperative that employs 12 people making soap. Even for a short trip outside her gates, Chase feels safer in men's clothing. She has stood up to local warlords and the Taliban. That has earned her death threats and a bomb left next to her building. I think it was set up to scare me. Here I am.
Like the girls who dare to go to school, the women who work with Chase are challenging taboos, trying to build independent lives. And that puts them at risk. They sneak to and from work every day, fearful a suspicious neighbor, or worse, someone else might find out what they are up to.
They're being picked up by Taliban now in town who are posing as taxi drivers. They're being asked intimidating questions like, what school should I take you to, lady? What that question means is, you better not think about having any kind of independent life.
Convoys from the nearby NATO military base rumble through town regularly. Canadian soldiers on their way to another mission against the Taliban. With only a few hundred out on patrol at any given time in a vast and dangerous region, it's hard to offer much protection to the people. The few foreigners left rarely venture out of their well-protected compounds. Ordinary Afghans have to fend for themselves. In the past year, there were at least half a dozen kidnappings that went unreported to authorities because the families were simply too frightened to say anything. So Sarah Chase practices with her AK-47 by her bedside, learning how to load and reload with her eyes closed, in case terror comes knocking one night.
What we are seeing is a kind of scarcely visible fraying of the psychological fabric. And what that means is that then it tears at some point. You'll see a big rip.
Nighttime makes people nervous in the city of fear.
Okay, it's funny watching that because I've been back now. I was back there last December, and it's gotten so much worse in that I was able, when I filmed that documentary, I was able, you always had the 20-minute rule. You can never be outside for longer than 20 minutes because that's when word could get out that a Westerner is there and you could get kidnapped. But back then, I was able to stay in a hotel outside the wire. Most of the journalists stayed on the Canadian base. I was able to film on the streets, as you saw. When I returned in December, we had to stay in an armed compound. We never went anywhere without complete armed protection by the police. It was much, much, much more dangerous than it was even then. So the challenge is you've got, 5 or 10 minutes to film, right? So how do you, so you have to make a very detailed list. We knew we wanted shots of women in burqas. You have to be culturally sensitive because they don't want to be filmed. So you use a long lens, you figure out how you're going to, so you grab some of those shots as best you can. We waited on streets because when Sarah tells me the story about women getting in taxis, I remember saying, well, I did hire a local journalist as well, so he could do some filming as well. We had to wait like 5-10 minutes and film every taxi till we get the shots. I knew I wanted shots of, and there's more of them later on, that sunset shot you see at the end with the gun and the sun. So we timed, we know when the sun is rising, when it's setting. The good thing about sunrise and sunset is they look the same, so you don't know whether it's night or day. And we would go out at great risk to ourselves to wait for the sun to be blood red and film the soldiers with their guns right there. When we meet Sarah and we know we're doing the story with her, when she tells me the story about assembling, practicing building an AK-47 with her eyes closed, I know I need that as a scene, right? So I make sure I convince her to build me that scene. She never wants to be filmed outside, but we do that little gate exit scene, to film the tension and her disguise. So that's when you do story, like with Truscott and with Brenda, I could do the storytelling, the storyboarding for weeks and weeks because I know when I'm going and I've got a few weeks to get to Peterborough. I could go to Peterborough ahead of time and plot for locations. You're in Kandahar, you don't know what you're gonna get, right? So you grab, you shoot, but you're still constantly making storyboards to figure out how can I tell this story. In the edit, things move around, right? I think I wanted to first start with Sarah and the gun, but it ends up being the closing shot of her. Same with the school scene. By the way, when you watch, I hope you'll all watch the new documentary on TVO in the spring, we go back to that girls' school and you'll see how it's much worse because now the girls, even in the school, are afraid to uncover their face. So most of them are actually still wearing the burqa, but there's some great scenes in our new doc. All right, let's see if you have some questions, and I've got a couple of other things to tell you about filming in a war zone. Questions about Afghanistan or filming, doing war docs?
I go for it.
Oh, I have a quick question. So this is like the exact journalism that I like want to do, but I'm just curious, like, not only in Afghanistan, but just like anywhere in the world, how can I as a woman like stay safe and like still be able to do these stories, but also like talk to people and get answers and all of that?
It's a great question. And you could read, there's some of the best, if not the best, foreign correspondents for print and TV are women. Obviously, local women, Afghan women and Iraqi women and Pakistan women, but Westerners as well, i.e., people who would stand out. at CBC, Nala Ayed, who is a Palestinian Canadian and was based in London. She now hosts Ideas. She's gone around the world into a lot of these places and done terrific work. You should read, God, what's the name of the book? Francine, it's gonna, the woman with the patch.
Yes, the Canadian woman.
No. She's British and she dies. She eventually will get killed in Syria. Colvin, somebody Colvin. Let me Google her while we're waiting. There's a great movie called Private War where Rosamund Pike plays her. Pike. Let me just Google her so I can get you her name.
I'll just say a few, and you know, I don't think you can kid yourself. If you're a woman in Kandahar or Afghanistan, it's definitely going to be harder. I mean, I went once, not as sort of as a journalist. I was accompanying the Governor General, and even that was tricky. So it depends where you are, but obviously you've got to make friends. You've got to be well entouré, well surrounded, and you have to know what you're doing, and you have to know exactly where you're going, and you need to be well accompanied. I would say it's not impossible, but definitely in certain circumstances, it's going to be tougher. And at the same time, it can be an advantage, though, being a woman, because people think you're not as dangerous, or you're naive, or so you get people to talk to you sometimes more easily as a woman. But certainly in a place where the Taliban rule, it's a bit.
But it's totally doable. The journalist name is Marie Colvin. Marie and Colvin, Colvin. You could read her book, or there's a great biography of her. She was a bit of a war junkie and alcoholic. She eventually will get killed for taking a huge risk in Syria, but you could see her story. For my current Afghanistan doc, we used a female camera person, not for most of our filming. Most of our filming, we had to go with a man because it was the Taliban and others were going to raise. But if you Google Kiana Herrera, Kiana Herrera, Hereri, I believe, you'll see her website. She's a Iranian Canadian. She spent most of her time in Afghanistan, takes tremendous pictures for the New York Times. She did all their photo essays, and we hired her as our second camera person. And there was another young woman from Australia who drove around Kabul on a motorcycle and did a lot of filming, and we bought some drone footage. So with the proper protection, there are women journalists. There's a woman who is featured in our documentary. She travels in a burqa, right, which is terrific cover, and did some filming and took pictures for us. So it's you should do it for sure. Just Michelle Lang was killed. She was a journalist who was covering the war from Alberta. There was a female journalist who was kidnapped in Somalia. So you just have to be careful, and don't do it without proper protection, which means you have to pay for security and a whole bunch of things. But it's definitely worth doing. Other questions? Yes, Mallow pointed out her name, Marie Colvin. Thanks. Yeah,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, go for it.
No, it's okay.
Okay. Before you went, were you already in contact with Sarah, the AK-47?
Yes. I'm just texting. I think it's Kiana Herrera. I'm not entirely sure. Yes, obviously you do a lot of prep, and then you're willing to throw it out. So even in the current doc, we hired a local journalist who pre-interviewed a lot of the people. So in this case, we were in touch with Sarah. We knew her story. We were in touch with the schoolmaster, and we knew his story. So we had arranged those things. But of course, once you go there, you find new things. So in the current Afghanistan documentary, we contact Isan again. We say, hey, I'm coming back 10 years after we met. Is your school still open? we arrange, and you'll see there's a great scene we filmed there. But there's things, one of the stars in the Afghanistan movie you'll see is a young woman who's Afghan Norwegian, who's a soldier and then turns into an aid worker. And we just met her at the security compound where we were staying. You come home at the end of a long day of shooting and have tea, and we meet her and we start talking, and we realize she's a great character. We convince her to come on camera, and she becomes one of the main characters in the documentary. That was never planned. And through her, you'll see there's an amazing scene where Graham, the journalist, meets a bunch of burqa women who would normally never talk to men, much less Western men, much less on camera. But because Aisha, this woman we met by accident, we tell her, you know, we want to get the other side. We don't just want middle-class urban women. She says, I know a doctor in Kandahar. Anyways, we land up filming a scene that makes the movie. So you can't plan for those things, right? You just go with it.
That touches on my question. Is this, contrary to the two former docs you showed us, were strongly character driven? I mean, these are characters, you know, life bigger than life. You know, there's murder and all kinds of things. This is an issue. This is a big story in terms of a war. How much, and as we know, every story has to be partly character driven. How much had you found a character? You've partly answered the question. Before going, like, whose story is this? Like, how?
All right, that's a terrific question. I hate issue documentaries. You do them either because that's what you're assigned to do and you get paid and you do them. And sometimes you want to look at issues, right? The problem with issue documentaries is when they're well, not always, but they can be exceedingly boring. Better write a magazine article. It's not television. But also from a more personal point of view, they are a nightmare to make, because when you do a character story, Brenda's story or Stephen's story, it's you're going to, one, you have a character, you have a great narrative, right? You've got them, especially when you do a crime, a murder thing, right? It's like right out of an Agatha Christie. It's a whodunit. And most importantly, you know, almost always you are going to tell the story chronologically. You have to tell it chronologically. Once you do the tease, if you look at the Stephen Truscott documentary or the Brenda, there is no other way to tell the story but chronologically. Once you do your opening tease, we start off with Stephen being 14, then we take him through the trial, then he hides out, then he nearly gets hanged, then he comes forward. Like, you just tell it chronologically. Brenda's a cokehead, she gets arrested, she gets cleared, you tell it chronologically. When you're doing an issue doc, where do you start? Where do you go? A nightmare. Avoid issue docs, right? When people come forward and they say, when I was a boss at CBC and people say, I want to do a story on climate change, or I want to do a story on Indigenous rights, or whatever, you know, COVID, I always say, that's a noun. We don't do nouns, we do verbs, right? You know, I don't care about a doc called COVID. I need a doc called COVID kills. And then you need an object. COVID kills what? COVID kills Indigenous people. COVID kills Indigenous people at a rate 4 times, you know, the average. Oh, okay. Now let's find an Indigenous village. Now you're onto a story, right? Avoid issues, right?
Well,
so
you have to make it somebody's story. I mean, like,
somebody's story, and don't do it in a where you start with a little girl, say this is her story, and then you go on to an issue for 50 minutes and come back to her story at the end. Now, Hope and Fear was 3 directors. It was a 90-minute doc. It was definitely an issue. So I just told, on City on Edge, what did I do? I told the stories of 2 people, a teacher and Sarah, right? And I guess one of the students, right? What we do with Ghosts of Afghanistan, which is also an issue, Ghost of Afghanistan, which is the new doc I almost finished, looks even longer now at 20 years, what went wrong with the good war. And the way we tell that story is, and let me show you a teaser just so you get a sense. I can't show you the doc, but I can show you it's not a teaser. Graham Smith was one of Canada's foremost war correspondents, your age actually. He was in his 20s when he gets sent to Afghanistan, and he becomes the reporter for the Globe and Mail and exposes some of the worst problems with the war. And I get assigned 10 years after I was in Afghanistan, to go back to Afghanistan to do a story about the good war and how it went bad. And we decide to build it around Graham. It's his journey, trying to come back and deal with the guilt he feels as a Westerner, as we all felt, because we all went there thinking it was the good war, and we screwed it up badly. So that, even though it's an issue, Doc, and we look at corruption, we look at women's rights, we follow his emotional journey and the friends he meets and he used to know. And that's what I think makes the documentary a success. Let me just show you a teaser. This is not from the doc. These are short little videos we did for the NGO that he worked with. So I'm going to share the screen again. And Afghanistan teasers. Let's see which one. Okay, we'll start with this one.
This is Kandahar City, near the front lines of Afghanistan's long war. A lot of the human wreckage from the southern battlefields arrives here at Mirwais Hospital, the regional medical facility. The dead are taken around the back to the morgue. So the last time I was here, there was only one container that had a couple of bodies in it, and that was at the height of the summer fighting season. Now he's saying they've got 4 containers plus another facility over there, so they have a lot more capacity than they used to. Back in 2007, staff told me they had trouble keeping up with the rising violence. We had no idea at the time that the killings would double, triple, just keep growing. You know, they've upgraded this facility with 24/7 electricity. And so it doesn't smell nearly as bad as it did last time I was here. And they've got body bags, which is an improvement as well. وظیفه بسیار سخت است. بسیار سخت است.
خیر نو که سخت از اون مشونو مستوالاری مجبوری که بینو خدمت دیدن.
Numbers can seem really abstract, but here at a facility like this, you really get a visceral sense of the growing magnitude of the war. You know, this is the biggest conflict on the planet Earth. At Crisis Group, when we talk to interlocutors, especially, you know, high-level political interlocutors, they sometimes tell us the time isn't right, the strategic situation isn't good for a fulsome negotiation with the Taliban. What I always say to them is, can you really picture the death toll? Can you imagine it? It's hard to wrap your mind around the numbers. But here, you know, when you see this mortuary facility growing over the years, you really get a feeling for the scale, the carnage. And at this rate, if we wait a few more years for peace, that's another 100,000 dead people.
Okay, now that is not the documentary. It's really important. That's some visuals that Graham put together for his group, the ICG. None of those scenes actually will appear in the doc. Even that great, we filmed that whole morgue scene. And by the way, it's funny watching it, those masks, we filmed this way before COVID. The reason you're putting off the mask is the stench from the dead bodies. Watching it now, I kind of figured, oh, everybody thinks we're being COVID, you know, but this was filmed before COVID broke, 3 weeks before COVID hit. It was just the stench. And I'm the only one who goes into the morgue and films those bodies. So that's a great scene with the morgue care, but we literally threw it out. We had it in all the time. And then in 90 minutes, we just said, you know what? We got to lose that morgue scene. And instead we have what's called a graveyard scene. But you get a sense of the filming we were able to do. In the movie, you see Graham's thoughts, but you never see him talking to camera like that. That was something he just had to do for the ICG. But I just wanted you to get a sense of the story. So what we do is we follow Graham as he goes and revisits, like the teacher you saw in that doc with the girls' school, and you see he hugs him, and then you find out it's even worse now for him and the girls. Then he goes and he meets a human rights worker, and it's even worse. And then we meet the Taliban, you know, so it's his journey. And our rule was there would be not a single old white man or woman from outside Afghanistan. We wouldn't speak to any experts, any people in London or Washington or Ottawa, except Graham. Graham is the only person, and you only see him usually from the back. And it's only Afghan people talking about what went wrong and what they think. So that's how we tried to make an issue doc feel very personal. And I hope when you see it, there are maybe 4 or 5 characters, right? There's Graham, a couple of, you know, young women, a couple of burqa women, a couple of soldiers. And that's how we try to take a very serious issue, but make it about people. But it's a huge challenge. So that's a roundabout way to deal with the issue question. We've got about 10 minutes left. So let's see if there are other questions. And then I want to show you one brief video that deal with the consequences of what we do. Robin wants part 2. Like the key thing about documentary work is always leave them asking for more, right? When people leave a documentary, you know, you want people to say, wow, I wish there was even more to that movie, right? It's like a good Star Wars movie, right? You want more. So
just, yeah, quick question. Like Australia, it's 2. Did you speak, I think it's Pashto, the regional language? And yeah.
Yeah, Pashto. No, I do not. Graham speaks a bit.
Yeah.
It's a really good question, because obviously language is an even bigger barrier, right? So we obviously have translators all the time, but it does slow things down, right? Because people are talking and then you have to pause and get the translation. At times we tried simultaneous translation. It almost never works in the field. So you do favor people who speak English for sure, right? But in a place like Afghanistan, it means you're going to favor the urban elite, right? So we deliberately, so you'll see about not half, I'd say about half the clips are in Pashto and in Dari. We had terrific translators. So that really, really helps. Paul in the chat group says, how do we take steps to becoming documentary filmmakers? I feel like the path isn't direct or obvious. Good question. So the thing is, you have a much better chance than Francine and I had when we were your age, because the cameras I filmed, the Truscott, were 60 pounds and cost $70,000, right? The camera I used by the time I was going to Afghanistan weighed about 6 ounces and cost $5,000. Now you can, when I returned to Afghanistan the second time, I did my own filming on a kind of GoPro. It's called the Osmo Action. It's this size. It weighs like about 2 ounces and it cost $400, right? And with a little mic gadget. So a lot of the filming I was able to do myself. So one, you could actually go do your own filming in ways that would have been impossible 5 or 10 years ago. And then you could edit, as my daughter does. She does her own editing for her docs, by learning how to do Final Cut Pro or Avid, and put your stuff up on YouTube, and try to stream it. So if you were going to apply for a job or apply, these days you have to do it with a production company usually. So if you were going to pitch, you want to do a story on women in Concordia and the discrimination they face, or how the football team in Concordia is breaking barriers, whatever. You can cut a teaser. You could with some of your great characters and go to a production company and say, here's 5 minutes, I could deliver 90 minutes. You probably still won't get the contract, but you could do things that we could never have done 10 years ago. So the thing about journalism is you could write right now. If I tell that to print journalists, you could go cover the courts, start a blog about crime in Montreal or about any issue you care about and start writing. But you could make your movies now. Start making them. Take courses, learn how to make them better. But you can't be a heart surgeon now and practice on open heart surgery on somebody. You'd get arrested, right? But you can actually make your docs right now, and just do it. Just keep doing it and doing it until you get better. Take courses, take internships, right? So you could follow me or follow somebody who's doing the filming, and you learn.
Just to add to that, I agree that there's a few advantages in being a documentary filmmaker now. First of all, there's tremendous training available, not apart from the equipment, which is available and lighter and cheaper and everything. There's great training. I think Concordia makes a pretty good, the department makes a pretty good job at turning out people that know how to shoot and edit and ask questions and be good reporters. And there's a huge appetite. This is a great time to be a documentary filmmaker. There are film festivals, documentary film festivals. There's an appetite. People want to see docs. The problem, though, there's always a but. It's hard to finance. I mean, that's why you need to know the more you know how to do, the more you're able to do things, because it doesn't cost quite as much. But getting producers on boards, getting the finance, we'll maybe do a workshop about that. That is the sticky wicket. Okay. So
it's a nightmare. It's a like, even if literally the Afghanistan doc was proposed to CBC, CBC said no. I think it was a horrible decision. And now when you'll see it on TVO, it'll be much to CBC's shame. I proposed a history series. I'm doing another book for Random House, my publisher, on the fact that Montreal was the Casablanca of the North during the American Civil War. In the assassination of Lincoln, all the Southern Confederates came to Montreal as spies. It's where they raised money, they laundered money. John Wilkes Booth comes to Montreal. It's a terrific story, right? And my publisher, gave me the money to write a book. We could not get History Canada to, and I what does it take to make, how could you not want to do a documentary on, Montreal as the Casablanca of the North? But they said no. So it is really hard to get financing, even when you're an established filmmaker. But don't give up, make your docs, your short docs. We won't have time because I was going to show you one little 4-minute thing where I did a doc that landed up leading to somebody's suicide. So I'll leave you with that cliffhanger. There is that story, though, will be featured in another doc I'm working on right now, which will be streamed on Crave in the spring. I hope. Well, we're supposed to deliver by June, so it might only be on Crave in the fall. It's called Kings of Coke. That's at least a working title. So if you watch that, you'll see the whole story about how one of my documentaries led to a suicide of a cop and the consequences of doing filming. Let me just end really quickly with, here we go. Just want to go to my slideshow. Here we go. Slide, play from current slide. So look, you can't find this presentation, but a lot of my presentations are on my website about storytelling and interviewing techniques with some video examples, or at least PDFs. So you can go to the website, and you can also keep in touch with me with email, or go to my website or Twitter, or through Francine. So I hope this was good. Like any good producer, I try to do things exactly to time. So we have just 1 minute left. I don't know, Robin, if it's a Zoom thing where it gets cut off at exactly 1400. But I hope this was good. Do you want to take a couple of more questions, Francine?
Yes, I think if you're willing, Julian, I think people obviously appreciate. I certainly did. I think. Thank you very much. Are there questions?
It could be on the things you saw, but also more whatever you want.
Questions, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question with regards to when you were in Afghanistan the first time. How did you navigate yourself around? Did you like hire a fixer to show you different places? And if you did, where did you find this person?
Yeah, excellent question. Fixer is a term that only we know in our business. Fixer means it's somebody you hire who arranges shoots for you and safety. Now, in some places, like if you're going to Germany and you need to find some neo-Nazis, or, I've done docs on that, you hire a local researcher who does some work on the ground. But when you're going to a war zone or a dangerous place, you need to hire a fixer who can find the things but knows the proper security protocol. So we had multiple fixers. We hired a fixer in Kabul who was a woman, a female journalist. She was terrific. She found a lot of the people we needed. We then hired a separate fixer in Kandahar who gave us access to the police and the places that were safe to go. And then we hired a third fixer to do our work with the Taliban. So we had 3 fixers for 3 different kinds of people we needed. Modern middle-class Kabul, conservative Kandahar, and then dangerous Taliban. And then kind of a 4th fixer in Doha, where the Taliban are now headquartered, to arrange interviews. So yes, and of course, we also had to hire a security company at huge cost, of course, because the security was much more dangerous. And then the other thing we did in Kandahar is we ingratiated ourselves. The first interview we did, which we knew we were not going to use, well, we didn't know, we assumed it was not going to be very good, was with the police chief, because we needed his blessing to know that we were in town. So if we were in trouble, we could call him. And then he kindly gave us 4 police officers who escorted us constantly, even though the police are targets by the Taliban. Some of the shots you saw there, we filmed because we needed the police to protect us, even though being with the police was probably also dangerous. So that was an also kind of fixer arrangement. We also had, I don't want to go into too many war stories, but we had a drop dead, bad term, but a drop dead policy where we checked in with headquarters back in Montreal and our wives every day at midnight. Trying to think the time difference, 6, I can't remember the time. Actually, it was, I think, 4 o'clock their time. In other words, if they didn't get, we had a WhatsApp security thing. If they didn't get a message from us back safely, they were to call. We had a series of numbers, the fixer, our main security protector, and then the Canadian embassy. So that if we went missing, it would only be a matter of hours before people could trace us. We also had trackers on our bodies. So the security company could know at least the last place we were before we would have been kidnapped or whatever. So we checked in every day like that. We obviously notified the embassy, but the embassy said you shouldn't go, and that wasn't much use for us. Afghanistan was so crazy. Of course, the embassy said, Ottawa said, you should not go, it's dangerous. We said, yeah, that's why we're going, to tell the story about why it's dangerous. And when we got there, we met with the embassy at the beginning just to say we're here. And on our last night, we were invited for supper by the Canadian ambassador, because nobody in the Canadian embassy steps foot outside the embassy. So they have no idea what's going on in Afghanistan. So they were just desperate to find out from these 2 raggedy, quite tired, smelly journalists what was going on in the country that they were ambassadors to.
That's a film in itself.
It was quite bizarre, but yes, that was some of the security. Okay, somebody says, been a pleasure. Yeah, very good. All right, thank you, Javier. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I don't think it's possible for Afghanistan because it's such there's such tension. But do you think we could go further than just the one-hit documentary where you go, you film your documentary and you do it, but more like as a foreign correspondent or as a journalist there in the place, you could do it in places that are with less tension, like I know in Egypt or places like that, and you do documentaries there and you stay like for a very, very long time. So you actually get a change.
No. I mean, look, the best, I mean, in Afghanistan, we landed up actually spending that second trip. We spent almost a month there, like 25 days, which was like way too long and way too dangerous. But the best journalists like Kiana or Mujib Mashal, if you just Google him from the New York Times, he's featured in are the people who stay there and never leave, stay there for years and years. And the best documentaries, like, don't fool yourself. My documentaries, I mean, I'm proud of some of them, but they're not hit and run. Like when I first started doing TV news with France, when I was in Montreal, I was in daily news, right? And then I moved to current affairs, and I went from 1.5 minutes to 4 minutes. And then I moved to the Fifth Estate with Francine, and we first started, we were doing 15 minutes. I couldn't believe 15 minutes. That was like amazing to have 15 minutes to tell a story. And I told entire stories that got cops arrested and got people out of jail, went all the way to Africa and did 15-minute stories. Then the Fifth Estate moved to hour-long docs, and Francine and I did quite a few hour-long docs, but even those were done in 2-3 weeks at most, right? We had about a month of research, a month of filming, and then 4 weeks of editing. Afghanistan, the second doc I'm doing, I've been working on for 2 years, right? Now it's partly because of COVID, right? But most docs I'm working on now, I hope this doc I'm doing now will be my last. I'll be on it for about 6 months. Afghanistan was 2 years, but that's still hit and run, because most docs you see on Netflix, the good ones, the ones that are winning Academy Awards and whatnot, are done for years, right? They spend years filming them and following people. But you don't have, it's like, you don't have to win the Pulitzer Prize for the first article you write, right? You start off small, you write a blog, you write a short story, right? Francine and I started with 15-minute docs. But yes, the best thing is to be in a place and to be able to stay there. That's, by the way, something else we could maybe end on this. When young journalists ask me what to do, look, right now, being a young journalist in Montreal, sure, but there's a dime a dozen, right? There's plenty of young, smart people who could make films and are filming in Montreal. You have to figure out what makes you special. So either you have access to something in Montreal that nobody else has. You come from a community that nobody has access to, right? You come from a cultural community, or you come from a gay community, or you come from a religious community, or somebody in your family has a disease, whatever. There's something that's special that only you have that makes you a foreign correspondent in your own city, right? You have access to a part of Montreal nobody has seen. That's what you want to emphasize. Or if you can, leave Montreal and go to a place where now you're the only Canadian there. You're the only person there. So that could be Peru. It could be, the Northwest Territories, where you're the only one with a camera and you could tell a story about mining there. Or you go to Egypt or someplace and you could tell stories that only you could tell. So if you have that freedom and courage and money, and of course you wait for COVID to be over, that would be terrific. So that's what you have to think about. What could I be special? How can I be a foreign correspondent in a way that nobody else could be? If you could get yourself embedded in a COVID emergency ward because you have a contact through your parents or a friend, and you convince the doctors to let you film, that makes you gold, because you've gone somewhere where nobody has gone, right? I had to go all the way to Afghanistan to do that. But you could, if you could tell me a story of a BIPOC student who is fighting some kind of discrimination, and you have access to her story that nobody else has, again, you've got a great story, right? You're telling a foreign correspondent story by taking me to a place that I've never been. So, I would just really encourage you to just do it on that optimistic note.
Just do it. Well, thank you very much, Julian. I think we'll have to have you back because on popular demand, I can feel it already. You have such great stories and no one tells it better than you. I totally encourage you all to go look at his site that he put up there. There's lots of good stuff there. Thank you, and good luck with, we'll all be watching on TV